Chapter 13 of The Boy Scouts in the Trapper's Camp by Thornton W. Burgess. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. Poachers. The behavior of the deer in the yard had puzzled Upton not a little. He could evolve no theory to account for it. Why at this season of the year should those two does have appeared so terror-stricken at his approach, and why should the buck have been in such an ugly mood? From all accounts he had read, and from what Pat had said, he had had good grounds for expecting the animals to be fairly tame. He put the matter up to Pat as they tramped homeward, but his reply was evasive and unsatisfactory. In fact, the big fellow was not inclined to talk. He appeared to have something on his mind, and strode along with a black scowl darkening his usually good-humored face. Once Walter thought he detected a slight shake of his head at Sparrer as the latter started to say something. He was sure of it when the latter abruptly changed the subject. Pat set a stiff pace. He seemed in a hurry to get back to the cabin. As he opened the cabin door and looked in, a flash of what looked to Upton very much like relief crossed his face as he saw that it was empty, it being too early for Alec to have returned. This puzzled Walter more than ever, but he held his tongue and forbore to ask questions. He felt sure in his own good time Pat would unburden himself. The latter at once went to work on the broken shoe, replacing the twine with a rawhide thong made pliable by soaking in water. This would contract in drying, and the broken frame would be stronger than ever. He had just finished the job when Alec came in with 2 marten. "Any signs of our friends, the enemy?" asked Pat whimsically. Alec shook his head. "No one has been near the traps," he replied. "I dinna think they will dare come so near the cabin." "You've got another guess coming, Alec," retorted Pat. "The murthering thaves killed 2 deer within a mile of here yesterday." "What?" exclaimed Walter and Hal in unison, while Alec suspended his skinning knife in mid-air and shot a keen glance at Pat. "It's a fact," Pat went on. "Sparrer will tell you so." Sparrer nodded in confirmation of Pat's surprising statement. "But we didn't hear any guns," protested Hal. "No," replied Pat, "for the very good reason that no guns were fired. They were not hunting, they were butchering." Then he graphically described for Alec's benefit Upton's experience with the buck that morning, and the story lost nothing in the telling. "Walt," he continued, "knows enough about deer to realize that the deer he saw did not behave as he expected they would, and he's been puzzling over it ever since. I'll tell you the reason. They've been hunted and harried in that yard till their nerves are on the jump, so that they will run from their own shadows, all but the buck, and I guess now after his scrap with the snowshoe he will be as bad as the does. As it was, he was simply fighting mad, knowing their helplessness outside the yard. Ordinarily he would have simply trotted off quietly with the does, but they were hunted yesterday to a point where the old fellow was desperate, and the proof of it was what Sparrer and I found." "What was it?" demanded Walter eagerly. "We found where a fawn and a doe had been driven into the deep snow and butchered with a knife," replied Pat. "The story was plain enough for anyone who can read signs. It was no trick at all for those bloody poachers on snowshoes to run them down and drive them into the snow. After that, no gun was needed. Besides, a gun is too noisy for thieves and lawbreakers. Walt didn't tell you what he saw yesterday. Fire away, Walt, and tell him." Upton told briefly what he had seen on the peak by the pass and his reasons for telling only Pat. Alec's face hardened as he listened, and a steely glint crept into his eyes. When Walter had finished, Pat continued. "You fellows wondered why I was so keen on getting back to the cabin. It was because I don't believe it is safe to leave it unguarded. As long as the snow was soft, these thieves kept away from the hollow. But with this crust to leave no tracks, they'll come down here, and they have been watching us. They know how many of us are here, and are watching our movements. They'd raid the cabin in a minute if they saw the chance. But as long as anybody's here, they'll keep out of sight. Hereafter we'll leave a guard when we go out. Tomorrow, Alec and I will start before daybreak to look for those fellows, and leave you youngsters to amuse yourselves. I have an idea that their camp isn't so far away as Alec thought it was. Now we'll have dinner, and this afternoon Alec and I will look over a couple of the short lines. One of you can keep guard here, and the other 2 can come with us, or do anything else you please." Upton insisted that he should keep guard. Hal decided to go with Alec, and Spar, with a little hesitancy, confessed that he would like to hunt rabbits. The experience of Christmas morning had whetted his taste for hunting, and following a trapline seemed tame sport in comparison. He was eager to try his luck alone, and when Walter offered the loan of his rifle, his happiness was complete. When the others had departed, he shouldered the rifle and at Upton's suggestion started to follow the course of the brook up to the beaver ponds so as to see the houses and dams and then go on to the swamp at the head of the ponds, where Spud Eli had found the rabbit tracks which had ultimately led to his finding of Alex Smith the fall before. It did not take him long to reach the first or big dam. It was difficult for this boy of the city to believe that this could be the work of animals and not men. And had he not seen some of the beaver cuttings in the Bronx Park at home, he would have been inclined to think that Upton had been stuffing him when he told him about the dam. There was little opportunity to examine the construction, because it was covered with snow, and was in effect a long, solid wall of glistening white. Beyond stretched the smooth, even surface of the big pond, with nothing to break the dead level of it, but 3 white mounds over toward the north shore. These he knew must be the houses of which Upton had told him, and he at once decided to go over and investigate them. As he approached them, he discovered several small mounds around 2 of the houses, but thought nothing of this until he noticed that the snow around them had been recently disturbed, and that the mounds themselves were not crusted. Instantly every sense which his scout training had developed was aroused. Here was something peculiar, and to be investigated. Could this be the work of the beavers? He would find out. Rapidly he dug into one of the mounds and presently disclosed evergreen boughs over which the snow had been heaped. Could this be some work of the strange little animals of which he had never heard? He lifted one of the boughs and looked at the butt. It had been broken off and not cut by teeth. Moreover, it was freshly broken. He examined another with the same result. Underneath was a larger one, and this had been cut with an axe. Spar straightened and looked keenly in all directions. A sudden suspicion was rapidly crystallizing into conviction in his mind. This was the work of man. What did it mean? So far as he could see, there was not another living thing in all that great white waste. The vast silence was oppressive. Involuntarily he shivered. For the first time the loneliness of the complete solitude gripped him, the more so that hitherto in all his life he had never known what it was to be absolutely alone. From boyhood he had been surrounded night and day by human beings, many of them evil, but human nevertheless. Even since he had entered the woods he had not been out of speaking distance of one or more of his companions until now. An overwhelming sense of littleness and insignificance swept over him. There was something sinister and threatening in the towering hills. He had the feeling that unseen eyes were watching him, and it made his flesh creep. He knew it must be, only a feeling, yet he could not rid himself of it. It is a feeling which everyone who is alone for the first time in the wilderness experiences. Then he shook himself. "You's a sure losing your goat, Sparrer," he muttered. "Buck up." With this he resumed his investigations. When the last of the boughs had been removed, he found a hole in the ice about 1.5 feet wide and a trifle longer. Along the end and both sides small dead sticks had been driven into the mud and close to the edges of the hole. These were about 4 inches apart and formed a little pen with one end open. Close to one side and projecting beyond the pen through the open end was a long, freshly cut green poplar stick fastened about 2 inches above the bottom. The water was shallow, and presently he made out a steel trap dimly outlined well inside the pen, quite close to the poplar stick. The chain fastened to one of the pen stakes. It was all perfectly clear now to even such a novice as Sparrer. It was set for beaver. He knew enough about the animals to know that their favorite food was poplar bark. The green poplar stick was bait. It seemed queer to think of a stick of wood as bait, but this is what it was, and nothing else. He saw that it was securely fastened at the butt end in a corner of the pen, and was staked down near the opening so that there could be no cross movement. It could not be pulled out. The only way for a hungry beaver to get it would be to enter the pen and cut it off, and so doing, he could hardly fail of stepping in the trap. Then he would drown miserably under the ice. The part left sticking out beyond the pen was by way of a teaser. It would be the first part touched by the animal, and would undoubtedly be cut off close to the pen. Having had a taste of the fresh green bark and no harm having come from it, the animal would unsuspectingly enter the pen to secure the remainder, whereas with the bait wholly within the pen in the first place, the animal would be suspicious and wary of entering. It was all very simple, clever, and diabolical. Sparrow's first impulse was to spring the trap, but on second thought he decided to leave it alone. It might well be that his discovery were better unknown. His life in New York streets had taught him that it is possible to know too much, that some things are better forgotten as soon as learned. He recalled what had been said about the illegality of trapping beaver. If Pat and Alec were doing a little quiet poaching, it was none of his business. They would not thank him for interfering. Of course the trap must be theirs. There was no one else trapping in the hollow. The poachers there had been so much talk about were working miles beyond the hollow, on the long line. He remembered now that neither Pat nor Alec had once suggested a trip up this way. Good reason. They wanted to avoid any embarrassing questions about those queer little mounds, for he knew now that each one covered a trap pan. The boughs and the snow were to keep the holes from freezing over. He counted the mounds. There were 3 at one house and 4 at the other. "You's better cover this up and make your getaway while the going's good," he muttered as he replaced the boughs and packed the snow over them until the mound was as nearly as he had found it as it was possible to make it. Then he made a hasty examination of the houses. The snow was melted on the tops of the 2 around which the traps were set, sure sign that they were inhabited. This was caused by the warm air from the interior escaping through the air holes, which were always left in the top of a beaver house. The 3rd was solidly crusted over, a reasonably sure indication that it was abandoned. Having satisfied his curiosity, Sparrow started back to the dam and followed it to the woods on the farther shore. He had intended to go straight across the pond to the 2nd dam, but his discovery of the traps had aroused his sense of caution, and he decided that it would be better to keep to the woods. On the broad, wide expanse of the pond he would be altogether too conspicuous should it happen that curious eyes were watching. As he skirted the shore of the pond through the brush, his thoughts were so busy with his discovery that for the time being he quite forgot to keep an eye out for rabbit signs. The illegality of this attempt to catch beaver in a closed season did not impress him at first. He had had nothing to do with game and game laws. They were entirely outside his range of experience. In fact, he failed utterly to grasp the purpose back of the laws, and like a great many others he regarded them as a restriction of individual liberty, and a violation as of no very great moment. They were to him very much as the "Keep Off the Grass" signs in the city park. So it was no shock to the boy to think that his new idol, Pat, should be breaking a law for which he could see no reason. But what did give him shock was the method employed. This outraged his strong sense of fair play. "It's hidden in below the belt. They ain't got a chance in the world," he kept saying over and over to himself. "They finds the food right there by the houses under the ice, where they ain't looking for no foul blow, and they helps themselves and gets a knockout without a show." He could overlook the breaking of the law because it held no meaning for him, but it was hard to reconcile this flagrant outrage on fairness with what he knew of Pat. "Maybe Alec's doing it on the side, and Pat don't know nothing about it," he thought, and with this confirming reflection he felt better. As he tramped on, his thoughts grew clearer. He recalled Alec's strong assertion that he was for protecting beaver. If Alec had been sincere, this eliminated him, and Pat had not been away from the cabin unattended since they arrived. Moreover, the traps had been set since the last snow, and that fact effectually disposed of both Pat and Alec. As he realized this, Sparrow gave vent to a low whistle. "It's some other mugs as sure as shootin'," he exclaimed. "Bet it's the same guys that killed the deer, and Pat and Alec don't know nothing about it." He paused, undecided whether to go back or keep on, but a moment's reflection decided him. Pat and Alec were out on the trap lines and would not be back until dark. He would keep on and have his hunt. The news would keep until he got back, but his newborn certainty that there were others in the hollow gave him an uncomfortable feeling, and he decided that he would keep as much away from the open as possible. For this reason, as he approached the 2nd dam, he was content to look at it from the screen of brush. It was similar to the first, but smaller, and there were no houses on the pond above. The 3rd dam was but a short distance above, and this was the smallest of the 3. Beyond this lay the swamp where he hoped to find the rabbits. That his nerves were jumpy he realized by the way he started at every unexpected sound. The grinding of one tree against another, Even an unusually loud crack of his own snowshoes made his heart jump. Once he could have sworn that he heard a stick snap behind him, and for a full 2 minutes he stood listening, but he heard nothing further, and nothing moved within his range of vision. Charging it up to an overwrought imagination and chiding himself for a silly chump, he moved on. Presently he discovered fresh rabbit sign, and this drove everything else out of his head. Slowly he moved forward, his rifle cocked and ready. Profiting by his experience with Pat the day before, he scanned every little irregularity in the surface of the snow with suspicious eyes. Presently he discovered a little mound ahead of him and a bit to one side of the path he was following. It seemed to Spar that it was, if anything, a trifle whiter than the surrounding snow. Study it as he would, to his untrained eyes it bore no resemblance to an animal. But presently he noticed 2 dark spots, and it flashed over him that they were eyes, intently watching him. Slowly he started to raise his rifle, but at the first movement the white mound dissolved into a long-legged animal which bounded behind a stump and was gone before he could get his gun to his shoulder. Disappointed, but resolved that the next one should not get the jump on him, Spar kept on. Sign was plentiful everywhere, and his hopes ran high. So fearful was he of another rabbit's repeating the surprise of the first one, that as he stole forward he kept his gun at his shoulder, until at last he was forced to lower it from sheer weariness. But in spite of his care and watchfulness he saw no more game, and at last sat down on a log to rest. He was tired, and if the truth be known, somewhat discouraged. He was too new at the hunting game to realize that this was no more than the usual experience of the hunter, and that his chances of success, if no better, were no worse than in the beginning. End of chapter 13.